friend recently that I was publishing a third novel in the series. She said, "You must be very interested in St. Cuthbert." And I wasn't quite sure what to say. It's true, I am interested in St. Cuthbert, but it's not the whole story. I'm also interested in his tradition, the ongoing story of his community and how it influenced the North in ways that still resonate for us today. St. Cuthbert is identified with the North in a unique way. There's no other saint quite like Cuthbert in this respect. His nearest medieval competitor, Thomas à Becket, is identified with Canterbury, but it was never a major feature. But from the medieval pilgrims walking the sands of Lindisfarne, all the way through the centuries, to the Durham miners carrying their colliery banners to the shrine at Durham for blessing, Cuthbert in his shrine has embodied the identity of the North in a way that transcends class and religious affiliation. So while the first novel of the trilogy, Cuthbert of Farne, is about Cuthbert himself, the two subsequent novels, Place of Repose and the new novel, A New Heaven and a New Earth, are more about the enduring relationship between the saint and the people of the North. If one wants to understand the North and its history, it is a unique lens through which to view it. That history is now no more than a footnote to the main story of England, but in the medieval period, the North was perceived very differently. It was a distinct and autonomous kingdom. And that was particularly so with the novel coming out tomorrow, which is set in the Norman period. For most of us, the Norman conquest is about the Battle of Hastings, Hereward the Wake, the Domesday Book, and that's about it. But for the North, it was uniquely devastating, and that devastation is often forgotten in the general narrative. The North felt more connected to Scandinavia than it did to Normandy. Resistance in the North to Norman rule was intense and prolonged. It led to shocking reprisals, the most bloody of which is known as the Harrying of the North. St. Cuthbert and his community were in the thick of it. So, in some ways, this is a Northeast trilogy rather than a Cuthbert trilogy, although his influence is present in all the novels. So maybe it's also, you must be very interested in the North. And that's true too. Northumberland is home for me. I grew up near sea houses in the landscape of the Cuthbert tradition. I was in Cuthbert House at school. I went to St. Cuthbert's Church. And in the happy days before mass tourism, we used to go in the summer holidays to Inner Farm to have picnics. And I knew where Cuddy's ducks made their nests in what I was convinced was Cuthbert's cell. But like most of my contemporaries, when I grew up, I moved away and went south. My present connection with the tradition began not in the North, but in a dark basement of the British Library in St. Pancras. I went to see an exhibition of the Lindisfarne Gospels in all their splendour. What took my attention, though, was a side exhibition of objects that had been taken from Cuthbert's coffin when it was opened in Victorian times. There was what looked like a folding stool that had been his travelling altar when he went to remote communities. There was his petrol cross, as behind me, made of gold and red garnet. And there was a small brown book, his copy of the St. John Gospel. I was riveted. The man I had known about since childhood stopped being a legend and became a real person to me. I felt as if he might walk in at any moment and pick up his things. I had a vivid sense of his presence. Afterwards, I was filled with amazement. How could this be? How could these things have been preserved through 14 centuries? The 7th century seems unimaginably far away, lost in the mists of the Dark Ages. How could it feel so immediate to me? Writing the novels has been an exploration of both things: the presence of the saint and the survival of his tradition. Although I've spent time on background research, there are just 2 primary texts. One is the Venerable Bede's Life of Cuthbert, which was a bestseller right through the medieval period up to the present day. It's still in print today. The second is extremely obscure and only available in a facsimile edition of an archaic Victorian translation. It is The History of the Church at Durham, written in the 12th century by Simeon, one of the monks of the Benedictine order there. They're both collections of stories. The first, by Bede, are stories about the saint. The second, by Simeon, contains the epic stories of the saints' community. They're stories about themselves, about their heroic devotion to the saint, about how they managed to preserve him through 4 centuries and 2 devastating invasions of the north. It is historically dubious and emotionally gripping. The stories are wonderful. I hadn't meant to write a 3rd novel about the Norman period, but the stories are so extraordinary, I couldn't leave them alone. So the unexpected answer to the question, how is the tradition preserved, is through stories. This is a talk about stories and how they played out over time, and how we find the original stories starting to create a new narrative 4 centuries later. So to begin at the beginning, we can say that if there hadn't been Bede, there wouldn't have been Cuthbert. There wouldn't have been Cuthbert in the way as we know him. He would have been another obscure name in the litany of Celtic saints like Ebba and Kentigern and Ninian, vague, legendary presences. But something different happened with Cuthbert. The Venerable Bede was one of the great scholars of his day. He wrote game-changing treatises on time. He invented the AD and BC dating system and wrote more commentaries on the Bible than you could shake a stick at. He was respected throughout Christian Europe. And he lived at Jarrow, just 50 miles down the road from Lindisfarne. He was only 14 when Cuthbert died, but the catalyst for the life of Cuthbert came 11 years later, after Cuthbert's death. The brothers at Lindisfarne had decided to dig up Cuthbert's bones in order to venerate them as relics. When they dug them up, they got a big surprise. And this is how Bede describes it. They expected to find the bones quite bare, as is usual with the dead, the rest of the body having dwindled away to dust. They were going to put them in a light casket in some fitting place above ground in order to give them due veneration. But on opening the coffin, they found the body completely intact, looking as though still alive, and the joints of the limbs still flexible. It seemed not dead, but sleeping. The vestments, all of them, were not merely unfaded, but crisp and fresh, like new and wonderfully bright. The monks were filled with great fear and trembling. They could not speak, did not dare to look at the miracle, and hardly knew where to turn. The episode has all the hallmarks of Bede's storytelling. It's dramatic, colourful, and vivid. The monks of Lindisfarne, realising they had a major saint on their hands, asked Bede to write up the collection of stories about Cuthbert that they had put together. Bede obliged, once in verse and once in prose. Many of the stories were to become iconic, like the story of Cuthbert and the Otters, which you're probably familiar with. I thought I'd read a less well-known one to you tonight in this time of pandemic. This is an account of Cuthbert during a visitation of the plague. Both Bede and Cuthbert were no stranger to plague. Cuthbert had the plague as a young man and recovered. And Bede, as a child, was in the monastery at Monk Wearmouth, and he and another monk were the only survivors of a plague episode. So this is Cuthbert during his time as Bishop of Lindisfarne, and he was a very hands-on bishop. At this same time, the plague broke out and dealt such havoc that of great villages and estates, once crowded with inhabitants, only a tiny scattered remnant remained, and sometimes not even that. Our Most Holy Father Cuthbert went round the diocese with unflagging zeal, preaching and bringing much needed consolation to the few people left. In one village, he exhorted everyone he found and then said to the priest, "Is there anyone left in this place who needs visiting, or can I now move on to the next?" The priest looked all around and pointed out a woman some distance away who had just before lost one son and was now holding another, dying, in her arms. Her tear-stained face gave ample proof of both past and present ills. Cuthbert went up to her without delay, blessed the boy, and kissed him. "Have no fear," he said to the mother. "Do not grieve. The child will get better and live, and you will lose no more of your family." Mother and child both lived long afterwards, thus proving the prophecy true. It's a lovely glimpse of Bede's relationship with his people, and perhaps a clue to the long-standing love that his people had for him. When I first read Bede, it was both engaging and discouraging. The idea that I might write something about this person withered away. Bede had done it already. And how could you compete with Bede? I gave up the idea, but I wasn't ready to give up on the theme entirely. It was at this point that the idea of looking at the history of the saint after death occurred to me. I discovered in Simeon's history the epic story of the community's 7-year flight from the Danes after the invasion of 866. It was full of adventure, and the saint made frequent appearances in dreams and visions. It became the basis of my novel, Place of Repose. It is chronologically the second novel of the series, but in a back-to-front way, the first to be written, as Michael mentioned in the introduction. It was well received, and I was encouraged to go back to Cuthbert's own story. This time, I was armed with a lot of new information. Professor Nick Hyam of Manchester University had just published a definitive history of early Anglo-Saxon Northumbria, focused on the very period of Cuthbert's life. It is immensely well-researched and considered. It was an eye-opener for me. Bede's Cuthbert is timeless and universal. He floats in a kind of divine ether where earthly things are only background detail. The political and religious conflicts of the time are not mentioned, nor is Cuthbert's antagonist, his controversial contemporary, Bishop Wilfrid. Nick Hyam's account explores all of this background and gives a different context to Cuthbert's life. His Cuthbert is both pragmatic and inspirational, a man who was able to reconcile and to lead his people. It's a different but complementary view that adds immanence to Bede's transcendence. I saw there was scope for a novel that might combine the two, and so Cuthbert of Farn came about. Of course, Bede's life remains the touchstone. Its popularity was crucial to its survival and to the survival of the community. It meant that it was widely copied at a time when, before printing presses, when less popular works might exist only in a dozen or so copies. This was critical when the community was struck by the first major crisis of its existence. In 793, the first Viking raid on Lindisfarne sent shockwaves through Europe. Those attacks would continue for decades, and monasteries were an easy target for plunder and slaves. But in 866, an attack came that was no longer a raid, it was an invasion. The great army of the Danes defeated the Northumbrians at the Battle of York and became rulers of the kingdom. When the Danish warships sailed into the Tyne, the community decided it was time to leave. They took the saint's uncorrupt body, King Oswin's skull, and the Lindisfarne Gospels, and they hit the road. This is the period of my second novel, Place of Repose. As far as we know, they didn't pop a copy of Bede into the coffin as well, but it didn't matter. By that time, 200 years after Cuthbert's death, Bede's life in the lingua franca of Latin had been widely copied and circulated through both in the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and in Europe. It was Bede's fame and the quality of his storytelling that ensured the survival of the Cuthbert story, and with it, of his community. During the early decades of Danish rule in the north, the monastic culture of Northumbria's golden age was utterly destroyed. Lindisfarne was left deserted, as was Bede's monastery at Jarrow. The great monastic centres at Hexham, Carlisle, Ripon, and Tynemouth were all destroyed, and with them, their libraries. Christianity, the culture of the word, was wiped out. If the life of Cuthbert had been the pedestrian work of a local scribe, it's likely it would have suffered the same destruction. But because it was the work of a famous author, it managed to transcend its local context. Cuthbert had become international, and this ensured the survival of the life. In the next phase of the story, Bede's influence was to be even more remarkable. After the 7 years of wandering, the community was settled first at Chester Street, where they were endowed with all the land from Tyne to Weir, as well as their Lindisfarne estates. They were the single surviving monastic institution in the north. Late in the 10th century, the community moved to Durham. Somewhere along the line, the monastic tradition got lost. And by the time the Normans arrived, Cuthbert's people were a married community, with the priesthood being passed down from father to son. The 7 senior priests of the community were direct descendants of the 7 loyal monks who had attended on Cuthbert during the years of exile. When the Normans came, things threatened to fall apart. First of all, the Normans were, in general, contemptuous of all things Anglo-Saxon, including their saints. Several minor cults got dumped and replaced by continental saints. When William the Conqueror came to Durham, he was highly sceptical about St. Cuthbert's claims to be incorruptible. He demanded that the coffin be opened and declared he would have all the senior clerics put to death if it was untrue. But first, he would have supper. It must have been a nervous meal. Fortunately, the saint intervened directly. During supper, William was afflicted with a burning fever so intense that he leapt from the table and, calling for his horse, galloped out of the city, never to return. They were reprieved for the while. Their next visitor was the new bishop, Walcher, a man from Liège. Luckily, Walcher had done his background reading. He had read Bede, and he was satisfied of Cuthbert's status as a major saint. And from that point onwards, the process of Norman takeover of the cult began. Meanwhile, there was an even more extraordinary development. A monk named Aldwyn, the prior of Winchcombe Abbey in Gloucestershire, happened to take Bede's life down from the bookshelves one day in 1069. It had an electrifying effect on him. He saw in a vision that his destiny was to revive the true religion of the early church that Bede's writing described. He failed to persuade any of his fellow monks to join him, except for a young deacon and a Norman knight who wanted to do penance for the bloodshed he had committed. The three men set out to walk to Northumberland, taking with them a donkey to carry the mass vessels. Simeon tells this story, and it is extraordinary. They were walking through a country at war, through the devastation left by the harrying of the North, which had seen every home and village between York and Durham destroyed. They just walked through it with the donkey. Eventually, they got to Jarrow, Bede's old monastery, which was a wreck. And there, they started their new order. I'll just read you how Simeon describes it. They went to the monastery of the Blessed Apostle Paul, which had been erected at Jarrow by its former abbot, the unroofed walls of which alone were standing, and they exhibited scarcely any vestige of their former dignity. Upon those walls they reared a covering formed of unhewn timbers with hay upon them, and there they began to celebrate the offices of divine service. Beneath the walls, they erected a little hovel in which they slept and took their food, and thus they sustained, by the alms of the religious, a life of poverty. There, for the sake of Christ, they took up their abode in the midst of cold and hunger and the want of all things, they who might have had every abundance in the monasteries which they had deserted. It was a revivalist community, inspired by Bede's vision of Cuthbert's austere spirituality. Even more amazingly, it was to play a crucial role in the reinvention of the Cuthbert community at Durham. Men came to join Aldwyn, and soon there was a primitive community of monks at Jarrow. When the second Norman bishop, William de St. Calais, wanted to get rid of the hereditary priests of the community, he replaced them not with Norman monks, but with Aldwyn and his brothers. The new community was not Norman, it was Anglo-Saxon, and it was directly inspired by Bede's account of Cuthbert. What was originally a record of the past had become an imagined template for the future. Simeon, our other storyteller, was one of Aldwyn's monks. He had a vested interest in the new order at Durham and little sympathy for the displaced married clerics. They were given the choice, he tells us. They could join the new community only if they renounced their wives and became celibate. One of their number only did so, persuaded, Simeon tells us, by his son, who had joined Aldwyn's order. Simeon, of course, commends the dean, but when I read it, I thought, what about his wife? What happened to her? How could she be just discarded like that? The misogyny of the Normans is the most hateful part of their influence on the cult, which had nothing to do with the original Cuthbert tradition. Part of my new novel, A New Heaven and a New Earth, is her story, Edith's story, the dean's wife, and how she came mysteriously to be the inner heart of the new cathedral. The novel has three voices: Edith, the dean's wife, Aldwyn, the visionary mystic, and a third, a man named Cuthbert, an an Anglo-Norse adventurer taken hostage by the Normans. When I came across Cuthbert's story in Simeon's history, it was hard to believe that no one had written about him. It's a story of the you couldn't make it up type, full of adventure and extraordinary coincidence. But Simeon's history of the Norman period is not just a ripping yarn. It demonstrates an inner continuity with the spiritual inheritance of Cuthbert that is easy to miss. From the outside, it seems as if the tradition of the people of St. Cuthbert came to an end with the Normans. The hereditary community was disbanded, the Saxon church was pulled down, and Norman bishops took over. But we learn from Simeon that appearances are deceptive. The monks who took over at Durham weren't Normans. They were Aldwyn's monks, inspired by his vision of an original, pure Christianity, brought to Northumbria by Aidan and embodied in the life of St. Cuthbert. The man who oversaw the building of Durham Cathedral and became its most influential prior was not a Norman either. He was an Anglo-Norse and the favourite of the King of Norway before he was brought mysteriously under the influence of the saint. Through an intensely turbulent time that brought great suffering to the north, the inner heart of the tradition was preserved. These stories are part of the inheritance of the north. They tell us about the issues that mattered intensely to our forebears and which still resonate for us today. They explain how it is that we can walk into Durham Cathedral and stand at the tomb of the saint who died 14 years ago, 14 centuries ago, why we can still see the remains of his original coffin, his travelling altar, his gospel book. It's why it seems important to me to keep telling the stories and why I have wanted to write this trilogy. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'd like to finish, just looking at the time, I'd like to finish with introducing you to Cuthbert, Edith and Aldwyn at the start of their stories. They're all to end up in Durham, but at the start of the story, Edith is the only one there. Cuthbert is in Lincoln, Aldwyn is in Gloucestershire, but for all of them, the Norman conquest has set events in train that will see their lives changed forever. I think it's probably only going to be one of them, looking at the clock. Perhaps we'll begin at the beginning with Cuthbert. Yes, I am Cuthbert. It has often been tutted at for a pagan name, but I pay no heed. My mother was Norse, that's all. And that was nothing unusual in the Danelaw. There were more Danes and Norse in Lincoln than English. And if it seems a far cry from the Danelaw to Durham, why, that's the story I'm here to tell. I grew up speaking Norse, but my father wanted me to be a scholar. So English it was. By the time I left the Minster School, I could read and write in Latin and English, reckon out a row of figures, and order a melody into parts and harmonies. I was a ready scholar, but the monks were more interested in my voice than my studies. A voice like an angel, they said. I had to sing at every endless service, when I would have rather been down on the ships with my father. I hoped it would come to an end when my voice broke, but no, better than before, they said. I knew the Psalms by heart, hymns, liturgies, all of it. It was to be my salvation, though not in the way you might imagine. When Duke William came along, it was nothing to us. We'd had Danish kings, Saxon kings, now a Norman king. What difference would it make? Lincoln was a snug little port, far enough inland to be out of reach of pirates and raiders. And if you were wide awake, there was money to be made. My father was shrewd. He'd made enough from his ships to buy an estate for himself. And by the time I was 20, there was land for me as well. Have I got time for a bit more? A tiny bit more. In the spring of 1068, William arrived in Lincoln on his way back from the fighting in York. The alderman turned out to greet him and brought out provisions to give him a feast. We were used to it. We lived on the crossroads of the kingdom. There was always some princeling passing through, and Lincoln merchants tried to keep on the right side of whoever looked like being in power. We gave hospitality to William and showed him the town. And that was our mistake. As soon as he set foot in the upper town, built where the Roman fort had stood, he had eyes and nothing but the view. It was a clear day, and from the top of the escarpment, you can see for miles. He'd ridden down Ermine Street from York. Now he could see the endless straight line of it stretching straight to London. And to the west, the Fosse Way unrolled into a distance just as the Romans had left it. Then and there, I do believe, William's mind started scheming. And William is to move troops into Lincoln, and that's where Thorget's story starts, and how he will end up as a hostage. And I think I'll have to leave it to you to read the rest of it and brings my talk to a close now. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Cathy. And you've taken us back to, as you say, a very turbulent time. Now, everybody, you'll find that general chat has been turned on. So please feel free to use it and send your messages to Cathy and show your appreciation. And if you have any questions for Cathy, please use the chat and send them to me. I'm there as event host, Michael Gallico. You should find me towards the top of the participants list, and I will ask the questions on your behalf. So thank you. And the first question that's come through already, Kevin Butler's asking you, Cathy, were Bede's writings and stories known to common people outside the monastic tradition?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. The writings were circulated to the literate world, and of course that was quite a restricted community. But there's lots of evidence that the stories were also circulated as an oral tradition from the 9th and 10th centuries onwards. There are stained glass representations of St. Cuthbert with, for example, the otters at his feet, referring to the famous story where he prayed all night in the sea, and when he emerged, otters came out to dry him with their fur. So I think there were lots of favourite stories that were told as an oral tradition, as well as just the monastic and literate communities.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Leslie Angel has a message for you, and she's still typing. We're still waiting for Leslie. Jackie Keynes is, I think she's over in Peebles actually listening to this. And she says, thank you very much. That was very fascinating. And,
hope the walk's going well, Jackie. Or is it tomorrow? I think Jackie's walking over in Peebles.
Yeah. All right, Philip Moore has said, your first novel might crudely be described as a romance. Your second was much more spiritual. So how would you describe the third?
Oh, well, one of the first readers said, what did she say? There is an adventure story in there, and there is a romance, and there is tragedy. I think so. It's hard to put it neatly into a category, I think.
Thank you. And Leslie's asking, she says, thank you, Cathy, an excellent introduction. Will the book be available in Greaves?
Yes, it will. I hope. The book is out and it should be in there. You do have just this evening to get a pre-publication discount from the Sacristy website, or Greaves will have it from tomorrow.
Good. And Colin Fleetwood has asked, how much time do you spend on research?
I think I'm not as diligent a researcher as novelists who write about, for example, the Victorian period, because one of the features of the Anglo-Saxon period is there's not much there, especially in Cuthbert's lifetime. Nearly all the records were destroyed by the Danish invasion. So I read whatever there is available. For the Norman period, there is quite a lot more to read. I don't do original research. I'm looking for the drama and the conflict in terms of writing a novel. They're obviously wanting accuracy as well.
Okay. Leslie Angel says that the ideal length of a novel has been debated recently in The Guardian. So did you have an ideal length when you were writing this?
I knew this one was going to be a bit longer than the other two, and it threatened to get a bit long. I think it's, I don't know, here it is, and I think it's just quite a nice length. This is, let's see, it's just a very neat 300 pages. So not a doorstopper, but a read to get your teeth into, I hope.
Right. And Colin Fleetwood here is saying, how do you feel about fictionalizing real people from history?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And it was one of the things that put me off writing about Cuthbert, actually. So I thought, if your job is to empathise with your characters, and if you have not yet achieved saintly status, how do you empathise with a saint? And I sidestepped that to some extent. The other three, there is very little to go on for the three characters who tell the story in this novel. And I felt a kind of carte blanche in a way, because we only know about them from very scanty records. So you're picking up very little about their character. And with Edith in particular, I have to say she's a completely fictional character. it's just a matter of saying, we know the dean divorced his wife in order to enter the celibate order. We know nothing else about him, so it's my speculation as to what her experience might have been. I don't know if that answered the question, but I think you have to take a deep breath and do it. And you know, it isn't a real account; it's your feeling. And as a historical novelist, you are doing that. You are taking a point of view about the character and hoping that it has an authenticity about it.
Right. Another question now. Sophie Hamilton is asking. She wonders what your next book will be.
Well, you might be relieved to hear I don't think it's going to be a fourth novel in this series. I'm actually digging around in some family history at the moment. And I'm interested in a particular area that my family came from and some of their more scurrilous background, and seeing if there's something that might be done with that. So that's on the back burner at the moment.
Are you prepared to let that scurrilous background be brought to light?
Absolutely. It's a long time. We're talking, well, back with the Jacobites, you know. The Jacobites, there's a lot to say about the Jacobites, so don't start me here. And there's a lot to say about how women were treated in my own family, I have to say, as goods and chattels, which is quite interesting.
Does anyone else have any questions? No, in that case, I think I'll draw the evening to a close. Right. No, that's not a question. Right. Well, thank you very much, Cathy. It's a great pleasure to have you talk to us again. At the start of your talk, you drew out this wonderful image of how you could picnic on the inner farm, you know, without interruption and things. So idyllic days, and you know, we can understand sort of how you've tied the landscape to the history and to the characters. I can see everyone's really enjoyed from the other comments that are coming through on the screen here. A quick lesson in Zoom for everybody. At the bottom of your screen, there is a reactions button, and if you press this, there is the means there to show on your screen your appreciation for Cathy. So I think we can do that. And shortly, I think you might be able to turn your own video on. So once again, a super evening, and thank you very much. Can I just reinforce something there? We do ask people to support Greaves as our local bookseller for this festival. Obviously, not having people in town, there's not going to be so many books, but if you go to Greaves, you'll start to see a growing collection of all the books that are going to be talked about in 2 weeks' time. So if you want to get your reading in soon, please go there. That, I think, is the end of the evening. I have nothing more to say. I hope I'll next see many of you at events during the festival. The first two events of the festival, the poetry workshop, which has always been popular, was joined by, this year, we added a prose writing workshop. And that too, you know, sold out within a day. And yeah, as I say, everyone is very encouraged, and we look forward to the festival. So once again, thank you very much, Cathy. Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you think the technology has worked well, but of course we'd be very glad to have any feedback on how it's working. And I will say good night to everybody. Thank you.